You may have noticed Barack Obama back on the national scene. He has a new memoir. It is 768 pages long, which is longer than the entire Hebrew Bible, like the first 5 books of Moses. It is also filled with a bunch of fiction. Joining us on the line to discuss some of that fiction is Rabbi Dov Lipman. He's a former Knesset member of the Israeli parliament. He was elected in 2013, making him the first American-born Knesset member in 30 years. Rabbi Lipman, thanks so much for joining the show. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Ben.
So you had an excellent piece over at jns.org talking about all of the falsehoods Barack Obama promulgates about the state of Israel in his ridiculous book. So there's a bunch of stuff he says about America that is patently untrue, but there's a bunch of stuff about Israel and its history that is just completely untrue. Maybe you can run us through some of that stuff.
Absolutely. And I'll be honest with you, as an Israeli politician, I don't weigh in so much on what happens in America, but to read a revisionist history about Israel's history, which plays right into the anti-Israel and BDS playbook, was really shocking to see. Number one, he identifies the Temple Mount as one of Islam's holiest sites, with not one mention of the fact that it's the holiest site in Judaism. That completely changes the narrative and takes anyone who doesn't know much about the conflict into thinking, what right does Israel have to have any connection at all to the Temple Mount, despite the fact that it's the holiest site in Judaism. So that's just the most glaring and obvious point. When he talks about the decades following Israel's creation, he says Israel engaged in conflicts with its Arab neighbors. Engaged in conflicts. All Israel wanted was peace. We have it in our Declaration of Independence. We reach out to our Arab neighbors all the time for peace. We were attacked on all sides by larger Arab armies and fought for our lives for the decades after Israel's creation. And perhaps the narrative which he talks about, which really impacted policy, is he talks about the rise of the PLO after the Six-Day War in 1967. This plays right into the playbook which says that Israeli settlements in the West Bank, they're the cause of the conflict. But Ben, as you know, and hopefully your listeners will now learn, the PLO was established in 1964. 3 years before the Six-Day War, 3 years before there were any settlements. This is an outright movement against the existence of the state of Israel. So this gives you a sense of some of the falsehoods that are in that chapter.
I mean, it is pretty incredible how anti-Israel Obama was when he was in office, and obviously Biden was his vice president. We're now seeing a pretty stiff competition among various interest groups trying to staff up Biden's foreign policy team. You have some so-called moderates like Tony Blinken, who himself is not particularly moderate when it comes to the Iran deal. He has said that he wants to get back into it. You have Biden himself saying he wants to get back into the Iran deal, essentially with no preconditions, including restrictions on terrorism or ballistic missile development. All of this springs from a worldview about Israel that is just historically unfactual, and you see it in Obama's memoir.
Exactly, and that's part of it. I was in the Knesset in 2013 to 2015 when there was all the negotiations about the Iran deal, and there was wall to wall from the Likud party on the right to the Labor Party on the left in the Knesset. We were against this deal. There was disagreement about how to go about it, but everyone was against it and realized that it was a danger for Israel. But I'll be honest with you, Ben, I was reluctant to jump into the camp of that means that Obama was anti-Israel. But when you read this chapter 25 in this memoir, and you see literally sentence after sentence of falsehoods and misleading statements about Israel and characterizing Israel as a colonial conqueror in its ancestral homeland, it has to lead one to a conclusion that the policies were the result of an actual ideology.
So we're speaking with Rabbi Dov Lipman, who's been a member of the Israeli Knesset. So obviously, I think that a lot of Americans would like to see being pro-Israel as a bipartisan thing. And the future of the Democratic Party seems to be leaning in an anti-Israel direction. Do you think that this is becoming the dominant ideology in the Democratic Party, or can they move away from it?
One of my goals in writing the article and spreading the article was to actually reach out more to the Democratic side and get supporters of Israel to call out the president for these falsehoods. And I'm still hoping that will happen. But there's definitely concern, certainly on the Israeli side. We want Israel to be a bipartisan issue. We want to reach out to both sides of the aisle for support for Israel. But there's definitely a concern about how strong will the more radical side of the Democratic Party be. And we certainly have that concern as the Biden administration comes into play. We are always going to reach out for a strong relationship with the White House and with our U.S. counterparts, but we also have to be on the lookout for this kind of ideology, which besmirches Israel and portrays us as an evil entity, which anyone who looks at it with unbiased eyes and intellectual honesty will realize is simply false. And we cannot allow falsehoods to drive American policy towards Israel.
That's Rabbi Dov Lipman, former Knesset member, He actually did the work of reading Obama's memoir. I have not done that yet. I'm trying like heck to avoid it, but I'm glad other people are doing it. Rabbi Lipman, appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Ben.